Well, welcome to our third week of Contemporary America, History 413. This section of the course, we've moved away from the 1960s and into the 1970s, but as you're going to see, certainly as you read through Schulman's book and as you look at my overview for the week, and then as you listen to this particular lecture and discussion, that you'll really see that the issues of the 1960s move on through the 1970s. And one of the things that I do want you to get out of this course is those issues are still going to be there in the 1980s. Some of them are going to be there in the 1990s and then in the 21st century, as we certainly know as well. So I want you to recognize the fact that as we pass into these different decades, we're not leaving the previous decade behind. We're actually dragging that along with us. And that's basically the point of history, right? Is to be able to look at the things that happened before and be able to connect them to the next decade and the next decade and the next decade, right? So that's obviously what we're doing with this course. Now, in terms of this book by Bruce Schulman, The 70s, I think that it's one of the better books on the 1970s. There aren't a lot around, and as you will see when you're going through for the reflection paper, this is going to become worse as we get through the course, that there aren't really a lot of books on the 1970s on a whole, right? There aren't a lot of books on the 1980s on a whole, and there certainly aren't a whole heck of a lot of them for the 1990s. But there are some out there on the 1970s, and what I really enjoyed about Schulman's book the first time that I read it, probably about 10 years ago, is that he really sort of captures the essence of this era. He really captures it in terms of not just politics or not just societal issues, but he really gets the culture too. And I think that's very important. And obviously, you guys can see that in this course, that I think cultural aspects are really, really important, especially television and movies and film. So he really does a good job of that. Now, do I agree with everything that he talks about in the book? Well, absolutely not. I mean, there are very few books that I've ever read that I agree with everything, and especially since I've gotten my advanced degree and I've read so many books on particularly the eras that I study, there's always going to be something that I somewhat take up in terms of not really believing in the opinion of this particular author, or in terms of the research, not really seeing even the same things in the sources that they've read. So I'm going to often bring that into how we talk about these books, and there's a reason for that. It's not so that I can talk to you about, oh, what I think or what I feel about something, but it's to illustrate to you guys, much like you've done in the reflection paper, that you have an opinion too, right? You have an educated opinion, and you don't have to agree with everything Schulman says. You don't have to agree with everything I say, right? You don't have to agree with everything that say Farber said in the 1960s book, and on and on and on. So that's the point of bringing this up, to kind of prompt you guys to do the same thing. Well, I don't really agree with this. I think blah blah blah. And again, I have an educated opinion about it, but you guys do as well, right? I just happen to have more years under my belt in terms of gathering knowledge about particular issues and events. But you guys have knowledge too, right? And you also have the ability to read in terms of these books, read between the lines, right? You can often see the bias of these authors too. And Schulman has some areas of this book where I think that particularly his liberalism shines through. And as a historian, you always want to make sure that you have put as much of your biases on the back burner as you can, but you can't always do that, okay? And you can certainly see this in terms of any books that you read from any academics, not just historians. So I'm droning on and on about this, but let's move along a little bit in terms of Schulman's main arguments. Now, I'm not going to talk a lot this week about the main arguments. I want you to be able to pick them out. I will tell you that he doesn't do the best job in terms of an introduction of giving you his thesis and giving you the main points. So you really have to analyze what it is he's saying to get that main thesis. But we'll talk a little bit more about the thesis next week, and certainly about his conclusions. But I'm going to try now not to really give away everything that it is that these authors are talking about in terms of their arguments, just so you guys can do the analysis and figure out for yourselves what it is that these authors, these historians, are trying to tell you, right? So, in terms of the main arguments that he talks about in the preface and the introduction, he talks about the stalling of the Great American Ride. And what is the Great American Ride? Well, remember we've talked about the American century, right? And from the latter portion of the 19th century, and certainly all through the 20th century until we get to the mid 1960s, the United States has been on that Great American Ride. And so, what Schulman is arguing is that the 1960s might have stalled it out a bit, but in terms of the 1970s, he sees the Great American Ride as completely being stalled out. What I'll tell you is that I'm not 100% behind him in terms of the idea that the 70s are a stalling out period. I think the 70s are actually not, I'm not saying that he doesn't think they're important, but I think they're super important. And I don't see the stalling out or the deceleration that a lot of other historians see. I see it as sort of a toning down of some of the things that have happened in the 1960s, and that we continue to ride those things into the 1980s. But his understanding of it is like that great American century kind of stalled out in the 1970s. He talks a lot about white backlash and what white backlash means for the 1970s, and I'll talk about that as well in a little bit. He talks about the Southernization of America, which connects to the idea of white backlash and the idea that some of the old traditions and understandings of, say, the Old South are now not only going to permeate the New South, but will also permeate other aspects in other regions of the United States. And one of those places that it will permeate will be the Sun Belt. And the Sun Belt is going to stretch out from the Deep South all the way west through Texas, through New Mexico, through Arizona, and all the way to Southern California. And we often think of Southern California as being a highly liberal place, but there are absolutely pockets of extreme even conservatism in Southern California, and especially in the 1970s and the 1980s. One place that there's some pretty significant, I wouldn't call it extreme, but pretty significant conservatism in the 1970s in California would be Orange County. And this is something that bubbles up in the late 1950s and certainly during the 1960s. But after the uproar of the 1960s, it really solidifies in Orange County. So that's basically what he's arguing in terms of that Southernization of America, that some of these older traditions of the South, maybe some of the racism of the South, maybe even some of the understandings about gender from the South are going to permeate other areas of the United States. And we'll talk about that in terms of culture as well, too. He talks about the 1970s as an era of reinvention. I see that as well. And what he means by that has a great deal to do with the idea of the sort of the me decade or the me generation. The idea that you can refashion yourself and reshape yourself and make yourself into who you want to be or who you believe you should be, right? So this is what that era of reinvention is. And he also talks about it a little bit in terms of politics and society and culture as well. One of the other things I want you to see in terms of the main arguments that he puts out there is the duration of the 70s, according to him. So look at the bookend dates for him, because he stretches it back a little bit into the 1960s, and he stretches it a great bit forward, I would say, into the 1980s. And I don't totally agree with that, but I do think, I mean, always there's going to be overlap. I mean, we certainly saw that with the 1950s and the 1960s. I think there's a little less overlap between the 1970s and the 1980s, but he doesn't. And I want you to kind of see as I go through this in terms of, particularly next week when I talk about 79, 80, 81, and whatnot, that I don't really see that overlap as being quite as great as he does. But again, you can disagree with me, you can disagree with Schulman, okay? So I want you to recognize that. So that's enough for main arguments for right now. Again, we'll talk about his conclusions next week, but I want you guys to sort of mull over what it is that he's talking about in this book and come up with your own main arguments instead of me sort of feeding them to you right now. So one of the things I really love about Schulman's book is that he is able to weave together so many aspects of American life during the 1970s. He talks about politics, he talks about economics, he talks about culture, he talks about society, even weaves foreign policy in there. He's so good at putting all of that together, and I think that the reason why I enjoy that, because I typically don't like such detail-laden books, but the reason why I enjoy it in terms of the 1970s is that nobody really does this with the 1970s. 1960s. They rarely talk about the 1970s as being significant or extremely important. And I think that's one of the reasons why Shulman puts all of these details in there and he talks about all of these issues, is to illustrate to his reader how important this era is. It's not just important in terms of connecting it to the 60s. It's not just important in terms of connecting it to the 1980s, but they're important on their own. There are so many things that happen in the 1970s. So I think that's what he's illustrating with all of these details. And I know it makes it a little more difficult for you guys to read, but again, if you're skimming through, you can really get the idea of what it is that Shulman is saying about all of these different elements of American life. He does talk a great deal about politics, and he talks about the presidencies of Richard Nixon and also Jimmy Carter. He doesn't talk a lot about Gerald Ford's presidency, and I'm not going to either. But I obviously want you to recognize that there's a president between Nixon and Carter. But the relevancy of Ford is so small in terms of the relevancy of Richard Nixon and then also Jimmy Carter. Their presidencies are extremely important because of something that each of them create. We'll talk about Jimmy Carter and what he creates for the political system in the late 1970s later. But let's talk about what Richard Nixon does. And we'll go through a little bit in terms of what Shulman talks about in terms of Tricky Dick or the liberal and conservative leanings of Nixon for just a second. I'm not going to belabor the point because you can read about that. But to explain that a little bit, the idea of Tricky Dick is that Richard Nixon would always pander to whatever political force it was that he felt either he needed help from or he needed to placate to make them go away. And Shulman will say that a lot of the environmental policies that Nixon created that are actually a significant part of what little legacy that he has, that Shulman kind of takes that away from him by saying that he actually was pandering to liberals to get them to go away and to not bug him so that he could actually, do his own thing in terms of conservatism. Now, there are other historians and political scientists who don't see this, so I want to point that out to you. And that I want you to recognize the fact that there are many people who think that Nixon actually would take an idea and he would mull it over in his head and he would come down on whatever side he thought was important rather than necessarily thinking about it in terms of politics or his own political leanings or in terms of, as Shulman talks about it, as what is advantageous for him. That there are a great deal of historians and scholars who suggest that, especially because he had spent so much time in California throughout his life, that he was an environmentalist and that he wanted to, quote unquote, save the earth. Right? So I want you to see that there are two sides of this coin in terms of Nixon. But make no mistake, he was thought of as Tricky Dick, and he often would look to the more advantageous thing for him. Say, in terms of his actual election in 1968, he often referred to the silent majority. And these were individuals that he really didn't connect with as a Northern Republican. He didn't connect with a lot of the conservative leanings of the Southern Democrats, because the Southern Democrats of, say, the 60s and the 70s are very different from the Democrats, say, of the North. So they're the people who are still entrenched in the idea of the Old South. And Richard Nixon pandered to them during the election. And he pandered to these people who he called the silent majority, that he said that they didn't actually put their opinions out there and they just watched the chaos of the 1960s happen and they weren't happy about it, but they didn't actually say anything. And he was going to be their voice during this election and to illustrate to people that there were individuals who wanted to go back to a quote-unquote simpler time, right? This has a great deal to do with this white backlash issue as well. But this is kind of where he gets the people get this notion of him as Tricky Dick. But Shulman takes it a little bit further, as I said, and he takes it a little bit further in terms of some of the really significant policies that he created, that people are always kind of looking at Nixon sideways and going, well, what are these liberal policies that you've created? Well, Shulman's argument is that he created these policies to get liberals off of his back so that he didn't have to worry about them anymore. But as we know, the most important thing of Richard Nixon's presidency, even well beyond what he did in Vietnam in terms of the withdrawal of American troops and turning the war back to the South Vietnamese, is that Richard Nixon was taken down in terms of his presidency. That many of the dealings that he had with many of the
underhanded things that he did during his presidency, and certainly the Watergate break-in that's tied to his re-election campaign, that he was taken down, that he was at the very least going to be impeached and more than likely removed from office. And he sees the handwriting on the wall, and in August of 1974 he actually resigns from office. And I have that clip of his televised speech in terms of him resigning. I have that on our website. But this is really his defining moment in terms of his presidency, obviously. But another thing this is a defining moment in terms of the 1970s and a defining moment in terms of the American political system. And a lot of people discuss like political apathy among Americans as being tied to the late 1960s, whether it's the chaos of the 1960s or whether it's the deaths of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy and others, that this idea that the hope of the 1960s was gone. I would suggest that it's actually Watergate that's really the defining moment in terms of apathy in the American political system. That maybe some of these issues of the 1960s helped it along, but once we get to Watergate, this is where it explodes, and this is where apathy just really solidifies. And this is something that we still fight to this day, and we'll talk about it again in the 80s and the 90s, and particularly in the 90s election cycles. This idea of trying to get people out to vote, trying to get people, and particularly young people, to not be apathetic about voting, because they were raised by people who came of age during the Watergate crisis and the Watergate scandal. So they passed this on to their kids to not vote, right? And so this apathy of the modern voter really stems from Watergate. Again, it might have been helped along by the 1960s, but it comes from recognizing with Watergate that you couldn't trust your political leaders. We were questioning them in the 1960s, and a lot of people didn't trust Lyndon Johnson. But by the time we get to Watergate, it is solidified, right? It's defined here. This idea that we can't trust our president. How can we trust our president? Look at these underhanded things that Tricky Dick was doing. Like, how are we supposed to trust anybody? Oh, well, let's not trust anybody. Let's just not vote. Let's just not be politically active at all. So this is something that we see that happens in the 1970s, and we certainly see this happen because of Watergate. Now, some of the other things that Shulman talks about have to do with the civil rights movement, or the supposed passing away of the civil rights movement beyond 1968. Now, I've already argued to you guys that the civil rights movement doesn't die, and that the civil rights movement actually is still there, but people go underground or go grassroots with it. But the other thing that will happen is that people will actually, African Americans particularly, will start participating in public life because they can, and they become politicians, and they become politicians who are part of the mainstream. So we see that layer going on. But we also see people, like I said, that sort of move the civil rights movement underground. And this is where we get cultural nationalism from. Even though Black Power and the Black Power movement or the Chicano Power movement were there in the 1960s, by the time we hit the early 1970s, they're there with a vengeance. And this is where we get a great deal of the ideas of maybe, I don't necessarily want to say violence against whites, but the idea that if a violent revolution needs to take place, that it can, and that some of these power movements actually believe in it, say the Black Panthers. But not everyone in the Black Power movement or the cultural nationalism movement thinks of this in violent terms. But what they're doing is separating themselves out and not thinking about the civil rights movement, not necessarily wanting to fit into American society, but to be somewhat separate and to illustrate power by being separate. And that's really what this idea of cultural nationalism comes from. We're going to see this in terms of feminism too, and we'll talk about this in a later slide. But we'll also see feminists start moving away from the idea of wanting to be integrated and have equality, and start thinking about wanting to be separated and wanting to illustrate the power of femininity. And so we're going to see that obviously with cultural issues and also with gender issues as well. We also see that there's going to be a failure of integration, and Shulman talks a great deal about this too. So think about how the 1960s, we think about, even though people talk about the civil rights movement dying or passing away in some way, or like I talk about it going underground, we also have to recognize the fact that a lot of American society was really changed by the civil rights movement. And even though we saw white backlash, we also see people who are going to be connected to the idea of racial integration, and that this is where racial integration actually stems from, the racial integration that we see in the 80s and the 90s and in the 20th century, that these are all building blocks from the 1960s. But we also see in the 1970s, and we'll see it in the 1980s too, is this lack of integration. And one of the ways that we have this lack of integration is in the American public school system. That there's a great deal of segregation in these public schools. And even in the 1980s, when I was going to elementary school, the issue of busing and trying to integrate the American public school system and not being able to do it, and there being a great deal of backlash by white parents of not wanting African American students bussed in. So we have this failure of this larger social integration that's going to go on. It's going to go on in the 70s and beyond. But I also want to recognize that there is integration that's going to go on, okay? So again, seeing all of these things as two sides of a coin. So you have the coin of integration, right? And you have the head side that's basically talking about the idea that African Americans are able to start moving into white suburbs. They start working in corporations that are white. They become a great part of the political system, and we see a resurgence in terms of African Americans becoming senators and becoming politicians, becoming governors, becoming state senators, becoming mayors. So we see that happening, and that's that head side of the coin. And the other side of that coin is the issue of there are still a lot of neighborhoods that don't integrate. There's certainly the American public school system that doesn't integrate. There are a lot of corporations that will get around anti-discrimination laws. So we see all of this going on, and we see a lot of this that still somewhat goes on today. But I want you to recognize that, again, with the civil rights movement, you couldn't just have snap your fingers and have change, right? So it's the same thing with integration. We have these little building blocks that are going to go on until we get to the society that we have now, which is not 100% integrated, obviously, but is very different from the lack of integration that we saw in the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. But we can even see evolution in those periods, right? Okay? So in terms of this idea of diversity, I want you to recognize, these issues of integration. I want you to recognize the issue of cultural nationalism. And Schulman talks about all of these things, but also recognize that Schulman talks a great deal about artificial diversity and sort of forced diversity. I don't suggest that at all. I think that diversity and the acceptance, quote unquote, of diversity is something that happens organically. I don't think it's forced upon people. I think it's something that people start to take to heart, and white America takes to heart. But he talks about artificial diversity, so I want you guys to recognize that too. And if you see his argument as being valid, then go for it, okay? Again, just because I'm saying that I don't believe in something doesn't mean that it's something that you can't discuss with me, because especially if you are able to support it well, then I'm not going to have an issue with what you're talking about. Again, this is all about you creating an educated opinion for yourself about these eras, and I talk about, again, what it is that I don't agree with in terms of Schulman or Farber or the later books that we'll be reading. That I talk about this because, again, I want you to recognize that all of this is interpretation. It's interpretation by me, it's interpretation by Schulman, it's interpretation by you. And if you can recognize some of these themes as, hey, I don't agree with what Schulman's saying, or I don't agree with what Dr. Stevens said about that at all, that's what you're supposed to be doing with the course, that you're supposed to be analyzing it and absorbing these things for yourself and really, really taking to heart many of these matters and figuring out what it is that you think about them. So I think the late 1970s are actually extremely important, and I know a lot of historians sort of put it on the back burner where they think it's a very silly time in American history, and I think it's a really important time. Not only do I like this era of United States history, but I also see it as connecting really well with the 1960s and obviously to the 1980s. But it's not necessarily often discussed as being connected to the late 1960s, and I just think it's a really extremely important era. And one of the things that is in this era that I think is really important is the rise of disco. And again, disco is thought of even musically as being silly, it's being stupid. I actually really like disco, and I think you guys can see in terms of the all of those musical clips that I put up for you guys that I actually just really enjoy music on a whole. But I think disco is a lot of fun, and I think that's what disco was supposed to be. It had a great deal to do with this sort of me decade and this idea of shaping who you are and then having fun with it. But it also reverts back to the 1960s, and the reason why I think it reverts back to the 1960s has a great deal to do with multiculturalism. And if you look at disco and you look at disco artists, that they are a variety of different cultures, and that you see a variety of different musical aspects of different cultures that will come together and that will be integrated in terms of disco. So I think disco is really important in terms of illustrating that the idea of multiculturalism has really become a part of the American fabric. If it's in music, if it's gotten to the point where it's in popular music, then it's woven into the fabric and it's woven in there well. We'll see this with rap, we'll see this with hip hop as well. But in terms of multiculturalism and disco, I really recognize this as being this I don't want to say it's a culmination, but it is a part of that evolution of multiculturalism in the United States. So again, disco, I think it's very important. Again, it's also very important culturally because of the fact that there's a disco culture that's out there, and it has this, again, this connection to the me decade, the connection to what Farber would discuss in terms of consumerism, deciding who you want to be, right? And so the disco era really is going out there and just, dancing and being a part of the music and partying, and some people partying a little bit too hard, and you have the rise of the loss of sexual inhibition, right? So the rise of the loss of sexual inhibition during the disco era as well too. Think of places like Studio 54 if you know anything about that. So we have a bunch of different elements as to why disco is important, and I think that Shulman does a good job of discussing that. And like I said, so many people just throw disco to the wayside, but it's super important. It's an important musical moment. It's also an important moment in terms of American culture. And as you can see there, John Travolta is there at the bottom of the screen dancing his heart out in Saturday Night Fever. I have a clip from that, or at least the opening clip, on the website too. So another thing that Shulman talks about, and I think is also very important in terms of the 1970s, is the revival of distinct ethnicity. This, again, much like disco, connects back to the rise of multiculturalism. It also connects to the issue of cultural nationalism and this idea that African Americans and Chicanos and Native Americans are going out there and they're telling people, this is who I am and I'm proud to be this, and you can't tell me, no matter how you try to take rights away from me, no matter how much you try to keep me outside of mainstream society, I am happy with who I am and I'm proud to be a Native American. I'm proud to be African American. Well, this helps to revive the idea of distinct ethnicity. And this idea of distinct ethnicity was something that we had in the United States in the late 19th century and early 20th century, and it came from immigrants. So this idea that you were distinctly Italian and you lived in an Italian enclave, you were distinctly Irish and you lived in an Irish enclave, and Germans, and on, Asians. Now, often with immigrants, they were forced to be in these enclaves, so they decided to retain and really hold on to that distinct ethnicity. But by the time we get into say, the 1920s, the 1930s, and then a little bit beyond, the idea of being an American and being a part of the melting pot comes out, right? And so we start thinking of immigrants and people who become American citizens as being American and being a part of the melting pot, as opposed to being a part of a particular ethnicity. And so people's cultural understandings of themselves start to pass away in terms of the old world. And with the rise of cultural nationalism, we really see a great deal of people who grab back onto their ethnicity. That people are going out there, much like a Native American would say, I'm proud to be a Native American, that people are out there saying, I'm proud to be an Italian. You see this actually in the movie Saturday Night Fever, this idea that he is an Italian, and he is an Italian American, comes from an Italian American family, and it ties into this movie. But it's this idea of, I am distinctly something other than American, that I am an American, but I'm also something everything else as well. And so again, we see this coming from cultural nationalism. Now, another thing that Schulman talks a great deal about is the creation of the Sun Belt and what he calls also the second war between the states. Now, the Sun Belt is going to run from Florida and the Deep South all the way through Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and parts of California, particularly Southern California. And although we don't often think of Southern California as being highly conservative, there actually are consistent pockets of conservatism in Southern California, and one of these places would be Orange County. So that's where we see that connection in terms of the Sun Belt. The Sun Belt is a very interesting place, and Schulman does go into great depth on it, so I'm not gonna talk your guys' ears off in terms of the Sun Belt. But what I find important about the Sun Belt is not just this idea of the politics of the Sun Belt, the conservatism that comes out of it, or the religious aspects of it, but also that people in the Sun Belt really decided to become individualistic, and they take on this idea of the West and this idea of individualism in the West. And this then will funnel back into the South, that we're individuals and we can create very creative styles of industry. One of the things that I live in the state of Arizona, so one of the things that I know in terms of Arizona is that in the 1960s, the 1970s, and 1980s, sort of the rise of the electronics industry in Arizona, and then eventually the computer industry in Arizona. And we think about it a lot in this day and age as something that is brand new for Arizona. But if you know the history of Arizona, it's been there for a long while. Same thing obviously happens in California, only to a much bigger degree, right? Silicon Valley. So we see this in terms of the Sun Belt, that it's not just a political thing, it's also a cultural thing, it's also an economic thing. So read what he has to say about the Sun Belt, because again, I think it's extremely important, and it's really going to tie into the 1980s and particularly the election of Ronald Reagan. But the reason why he talks about the second war between the states is that a great deal of the culture of the Sun Belt, unfortunately, comes from the traditional values of the Old South. So we talk a lot about the New South, and there are veins of the New South that are different, obviously, and there's much more racial integration in the New South. But you also have people in the New South who hearken back to the Old South, and think about things we've just looked at recently in terms of the Confederate flag. That you have individuals in the South that are very much tied into that old culture, and this slips out into the Sun Belt, slips out into the West. So you're going to see that not only in terms of the 1970s, but you'll see it beyond and even to this day. So the reason why it's the second war between the states is because the culture of the Sun Belt is so very much different than say from the Rust Belt in the Northeast. Very different cultures. So I want you to recognize it as, again, it's just a historian's terminology, this idea of the second war between the states, but you'll be able to see some of those cultural and social traditions that are from that Old South that are going to tie into the Sun Belt. Then we also have Schulman and other people talking about the Me Decade. The Me Decade is something that the author Tom Wolfe actually created this idea. It's from an article, a fictional article that he wrote. And the Me Decade really is about this idea. It's not about me, per se. It has a great deal to do with refashioning me, reshaping me. And this again comes from that idea of cultural nationalism, right? This idea that I can take who I am and I can not only be proud of who I am and who I am at my core, but I can actually shape myself into something. I can actually shape myself into somebody new and someone different, and someone who I put out there to the rest of the world and say, I'm not ashamed of who I am, this is who I am. You're going to see this obviously in terms of the 21st century, in terms of gay rights and in terms of gay lifestyles, and this idea that it is now something that is well accepted, but it's not something that was accepted before. Well, the same way with the Me Decade, this idea of working on yourself to sort of reveal the true you. And when you're working on revealing the true you, obviously you're quite self-centered when you're working on that, so that's where part of this me idea comes from. But it's about working on me and making myself who it is that I know I can be, and putting that identity out there to people and showing it to people and saying, I'm not ashamed of it. And that's what the Me Decade is. It's about refashioning, reshaping yourself, letting your true core come out. Now we could also connect that a little bit to some of Farber's ideas, right? And this idea of the marketplace. So this is kind of a marketplace of identity, right? He talked about the marketplace of ideas. This is the marketplace of identity. It's not to say that people who are doing this are becoming people that they're not supposed to be. Some people, I guess, do appropriate some of these identities, but I like to think of it about of revealing your core and revealing who you are, and maybe polishing that core up a little bit, but revealing who you truly believe yourself to be. So that's what the me decade's about, and sometimes it is about being self-centered and being me, but it often has a lot to do with identity issues. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the presidency of Jimmy Carter, and then we'll move along to our last few issues. The presidency of Jimmy Carter is really interesting because Carter is able to win over a lot of people that political pundits didn't believe he could win over. And the reason why he could win them over was, number one, was because he was a Southerner, and also because of the fact that he was a very religious man. And so he appealed to a wide variety of Americans, even people who were in the New South that adhere to the Old South's issues. Now, as I mentioned before, the New South can be seen, again, talk about a coin, two sides of a coin. Parts of the New South are extremely tied into the Old South, and also parts of the New South are going to be people like Jimmy Carter or, say, Bill Clinton, who believe in civil rights, who believe in gender rights, who are very progressive people. So again, two sides of the coin of the New South, but there are elements of the Old South in that New South. So that's how Carter is able to actually win over the South, as he not only wins over those people who are progressive, but he also wins over those people who are traditionalists, especially if they're religious traditionalists. So he's like this, down home boy, and this person that, he's from Georgia, and he comes from a family of peanut farmers. So he's very normal. He's not from a highfalutin Yankee family, right? He's able to connect with a great deal of people, and he's able to connect into the Sun Belt too. And the Sun Belt's very important for him, but it's going to be the last time that the Sun Belt is important for a Democrat. It's going to be tied into the Republicans very quickly. But again, it illustrates how much Carter was able to appeal to people when he was being elected. Unfortunately, after he becomes the president, he doesn't appeal to many people after that. And the reason why is the same way that he ran in terms of being an outsider from Washington, because he had been governor of Georgia, he ran on this idea that I'm not a Washington insider. But then when he got to Washington, unfortunately, as president, you need to be an insider because you're not going to have Congress on your side. You're not going to have lobbyists on your side. And so you're going to be putting yourself into a system and a very traditional system that is going to look at you and sort of point its fingers at you and say, you think you can come in here and change this? You can't. And that's unfortunately what happened to Jimmy Carter. Another thing that unfortunately happened to Jimmy Carter is that people saw him as a problem solver when he was being elected, when he was running for president, but he ended up being somebody who had, number one, a great deal of problems that would occur on his watch, that things just kind of blew up, particularly in terms of foreign policy in the Middle East and the energy crisis and then inflation and all of that. So a lot of things blew up in his face that he didn't necessarily have a connection with initially. Maybe he could have created policies that made them better, but they weren't things that he could have controlled because many of the core of these things happened before he became president. But this idea of him being a problem solver passes away in his presidency, and he becomes somebody who people see as creating problems or not being able to solve problems. And he becomes sort of the face of national decline. And he actually tells people that he believes that these are the malaise days of the United States, that he believes that the United States is in a period of significant decline, and that there are things that we need to do in order to help the United States get back on its feet again. And for Americans, they really didn't want to hear from the president that he was accepting that this was a malaise period for the United States, or that this was a terrible economic period, and that we just need to accept it and then try to work with it. That's not what the American public wanted to hear. They wanted to hear problem solving, and they wanted to hear, we're still the best, we're still America, let's fix this, let's move on. And that's not what he did. He just really accepted a lot of the things that were happening. So he has a great deal of failed policies, and John Travolta is blurring some of this here, but this significant economic decline in inflation that happens during his presidency, and the idea that with inflation, that consumer goods become so expensive that Americans can no longer buy them. And then Americans again talk about the consumer idea that Farber had, this idea that Americans are so connected to the idea of consumerism, that this is something that's going to hurt them at their core in terms of national identity, right? So this again is something that Carter can't fix or doesn't make it sound like to the American public that he's going to fix it. And so this really hurts him in terms of his presidency, and as we know, he does not win his second term. That's going to be for our next week, because I want to tie in what happens with Carter into the election of Ronald Reagan. So I don't want to go too far into that, but I want you to recognize that this is a period of time for Americans in which they felt very badly about themselves. And some people tie this back into the 1960s. Some people tie this into Vietnam and the loss in Vietnam in 1975 finally. But we also see this in terms of economic issues and people feeling badly about themselves, not only because they can't provide for their families, but that they can't tap into that larger American dream of consumerism. So here we go. Here are the final themes that Schulman talks about in the book The 70s. And I've peppered in a little bit in terms of some of the things that I've seen in terms of the main themes of the 70s for me. He talks a lot about this idea of the noble outlaw. Cowboys, and say somebody like Dirty Harry. Clint Eastwood's character, Dirty Harry. Bob Dylan is somebody who connects to this idea of the noble outlaw, and he has multiple albums that sort of deal with him as being this noble outlaw. And I know Schulman talks a great deal about that too, so I won't belabor it. Even in the later 70s, this idea of like Charlie Bronson and this vigilante justice idea with the Death Wish movies. So that the noble outlaw, the guy that's outside of the law, but he's doing it for these noble means, right? So we'll see this in the films of the 1970s. This idea of cowboys, this idea of people stepping outside of the law to help others, and this is clearly what Schulman is talking about. And I identify it very specifically with people like Eastwood and also Charlie Bronson in terms of movies that are out in the 1970s. I think these are two very important characters. I mean, there are multiple Dirty Harrys and there are multiple Death Wishes too from Charlie Bronson, but the noble outlaw. But I think that Schulman really brings up this interesting point about Dylan. So I want you guys to focus on that as well. Then we have the creation of punk rock, and punk rock is really something that is not native to the United States. It's not just happening in the United States, it's certainly happening in Great Britain as well, and other places in the world too, but the United States and Great Britain really are these hotbeds of punk rock. You have the Sex Pistols in the UK, you have the Ramones in the United States. Those are very different types of punk rock. The Ramones are a little bit different because they're a lot more subtle in what it is that they're talking about with their music, and some of their music can come off as sounding a little bit silly, but if you dig through it, you can understand that they're actually talking about some really deep issues from the 1970s. But other bands like the Clash and the Sex Pistols and other punk bands that are pretty deep into the American underground system, those punk rock groups really put that out there. They put out their political beliefs. They put out, for Sex Pistols, say they're anti-royals. So they put out those understandings to the larger world. So some punk rock bands are very explicit in terms of what they're telling people, and others are a little more subtle, like say the Ramones. But the idea is like not really having illusions here, not having illusions about life. And a lot of people connect the punk rock movement to, again, this passing away of the hope of the 1960s, that now we have to get to the nitty gritty here, and we have to recognize the fact that we can have no illusions, and we can't trust anyone, we have to be anti-establishment, and on and on and on. Obviously connects a lot in terms of this anti-establishment idea. Number one, you can think about things like Watergate, but you can also think about what I was talking about with cultural nationalism and the idea that We're not trying to blend into the system and the establishment. We're actually trying to divorce ourselves from that and to illustrate power by doing that. And you see that in the feminist movement as well. But punk rock really illustrates that idea of no illusions, right? Of really looking at the establishment and saying, you know, I know what this is. I know who somebody like Richard Nixon is. I know who somebody like Jimmy Carter is. I know who the Prime Minister of England is. I know who Queen Elizabeth is. I know who these people are. I know what they want. They're simply tyrants. They're simply people who are trying to strip rights away from people, or in terms of punk rock, very anti-corporate, right? So anti-consumerism and things like that. So this idea that we can have no illusions about what's going on around us, and that punk rock is really trying to tell you to be anti-establishment. I think the punk rock movement is very interesting. I only put mainstream stuff in terms of the clips that I show you guys, because I think mainstream music is really important. What makes it into the mainstream illustrates acceptance by the larger public. So a lot of things that are going on in the underground scene are not going to be accepted, but things like the Sex Pistols and the Ramones really are. So I want you guys to recognize the fact that punk rock is a really important musical movement, and I'm not going to say it's more important than disco. I know that a lot of people would. I'm not going to say that because I've told you already how important I think disco is. But punk rock is super important, okay? Punk rock is important in terms of the anti-corporatism idea and the anti-establishment idea. And that's going to obviously harken back to the 1960s, right? But it's also going to be something that's woven into music from this point forward too, into heavy metal, and into hard rock. And then eventually, and I think this is the most important point, especially for the modern age, eventually into rap and hip hop. So it really comes a great deal. I think we can see the trajectory and the history here is coming from the 1960s and moving forward through these generations and these decades. And I think punk rock is really a bright light here in terms of that. Okay, gender rights and feminism. So gender rights and feminism, I've already talked about it twice now, I think, in terms of cultural nationalism and feminism. So this idea of, before, the first wave of feminism was about inclusion, equality. So the picture that's on the bottom here, equality, the time is now, the Equal Rights Amendment, things like that. Or you have people who are moving into the second wave of feminism, which is this idea of elimination of hierarchy. So the women at the top here, the women's liberation movement, to be liberated from what others think they're supposed to be liberated from the establishment, to be liberated from the chains of being a woman in American society, to be liberated to be who you want to be, and to be able to choose to be the leader of a corporation, or to choose to be a teacher, that to choose to be a mother, as opposed to doing it because that's what you're supposed to do, right? So the idea of choice and liberating yourself in terms of choice. So liberating yourself from the larger hierarchy, the patriarchal society that you're living in. So do you see the separation here in terms of feminism? So again, this idea that first wave is inclusion, getting equality, and the second wave is about liberation and making sure that you have choices, and illustrating your power by separating yourself. And also illustrating the power of women by separating yourself from men and not wanting to become like men, but to illustrate to people who you are as a woman and what it means to be a woman. So that's what goes on a great deal in terms of feminism. We also have other gender rights issues that go on, particularly the gay rights movement is going to somewhat bubble up at this point in time. You're really going to see it occur in the 1980s, especially with the AIDS epidemic and the way that gays are treated during the AIDS epidemic. And then you're also going to see, obviously, how much that connects to the 21st century. But the gay rights movement was there before the 1960s. But the 1960s and the idea of, again, identity and acceptance of identity is really going to allow for the gay rights movement to propel itself into the mainstream. And I think that's extremely important as well. We also have the men's movement that occurs. And the men's movement is much like white backlash. It's this idea that, women are out there fighting for rights, and gays are out there fighting for rights, and African Americans are out there fighting for their rights. and white men are being marginalized, and white men need to have a voice. And so we have the men's movement, and we illustrate to people that we are masculine and we are hyper masculine, and we want to be hyper masculine. This is who we believe ourselves to be, and much like everybody else in the me decade, we have fashioned ourselves into this. We are accepting of it, and this is who we want to be, and we don't want to be marginalized. And so that's what the men's movement is about. But what's also interesting that happens with the male gender, and certainly in terms of elements of who you are, if you adhere to the gender of being male, if you adhere to maleness, okay, that you also have this sensitivity issue that comes up in the late 1970s. You have people like Alan Alda that talk about being the sensitive man, that you can tap into your feminine side and you can become a sensitive man, and you can become a man who cares for others and can show their feelings and can be sensitive. And so you also have this other side of the coin too, this idea that men, again, in this me generation and this me decade, are shaping themselves and fashioning themselves and moving themselves away from this traditional style of masculinity, even though there are men who are holding on desperately to that idea of traditional masculinity. So you have two different things that are going on for men, and I think that's very important. Again, one of those things we don't talk about a lot is men's rights, number one, but also in terms of just masculinity and what masculinity means in this era of the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s today, where you have so much cultural liberation going on. You have so much identity liberation going on, and you have so much going on in terms of race and ethnicity that white men feel marginalized, and again, they backlash against that. But you also have white men who take it upon themselves to say, I like this idea of liberation. I like this idea of being proud of who I am, but I also can fashion myself into somebody who's very different from traditional masculinity, and I can fashion myself into, the quote-unquote sensitive man, that I can be whatever I want to be. Again, me generation, me decade. This idea that I can be who I want to be. I don't have to adhere to old traditions, or if I want to adhere to old traditions, I certainly can do that too. So the men's movement, I think, is really interesting, and a lot of people don't talk about it. So for one quick second here, I'm going to talk about the new right. Schulman talks about the new right and what that means for the political process. The new right is a new type of conservative. It's a different conservative from, say, the conservatives in the 1950s, the anti-communism style conservative, the conservative that always believed in traditional ideals and traditional values. Now, anti-communism is going to be somewhat of a part of the new right, but there are going to be a lot of social issues that the new right takes on that is very different from this old style. And I'm not going to belabor the point right now. I want you guys to read about it, because I would much prefer to talk about it in terms of connecting it to Ronald Reagan and connecting it to the ascendancy of the conservatives in the 1980s, because the new right has a great deal to do with this. So be able to recognize, how the new right sort of bubbles up and what Schulman has to say about the new right, and then let's next week really connect it to Ronald Reagan and connect it to not only his initial run for the presidency and when he wins in 1980, but also connected to his ability to have two different terms. And the new right also becomes hyper religious in the 1980s as well. So we'll talk about that in our next session. So let's move on and let's talk about what really is sort of my main thesis for the 1970s and how I somewhat connect it to the 1980s. So this is basically my understanding of the 1970s, and I want you to recognize how I connect the 70s to the 60s and then also to the 80s in terms of this broader thesis. So my understanding of the 1970s, and again, you can totally disagree with me, this is what I have seen in terms of my own studies, that the events of the 1970s, as many people believed, may have been a reaction to the 1960s, absolutely. But there were many ways in which this decade was also an extension of the progress of that chaos, that it was an extension of the 1960s, that we had events in the 1970s that proved backlash, right? But we also have a majority of issues too that also prove this extension of progress. So cultural nationalism, the rise of the second wave of feminism, the sensitive men's movement, right? So an extension of these things, African Americans going into political and business life. Integration of some neighborhoods, right? So we have this where we can see backlash, but we can also see that the promises of the 1960s and the hope of the 1960s are still moving along. It's not just out there in your face, right? So that's why I say that that it's just a much calmer tone. That it's not the same, that the 70s or the 60s rather kind of laid the foundation, right? And the 70s really takes all that work that was done in the 60s and people kind of quietly drag it along. And I think that's a really important thing to recognize in terms of the 1970s, because that's what makes it important. And again, I think Schulman does a great job of illustrating its importance and illustrating how many important things happened in the 1970s. But I also think that he doesn't talk about the idea that the 70s are important because they are such an extension of the 60s. And he does talk about it indirectly being an extension of the 1960s rather, that the 70s are somehow this extension. So he indirectly talks about it, but he doesn't really throw it out there as a main argument or a main thesis like I do. And I really see these years as, again, backlash. Absolutely there's backlash going on, but those foundation blocks have already been set there, and the stones are firmly planted, and we're going to keep building and building and building from there. So I also suggest that the tenor of what I think are the not-so-malaise days of the 1970s would actually carry on into the 1980s, but there's going to be some significant magnification of this tenor. So really this calmer tone is going to kind of pass away a little bit, but we're going to consistently see, again, backlash is going to continue to occur, and we're also going to see the extension of progress. So that's going to occur as well. So you see how I'm threading these decades together here, and that's really what I want you guys to be able to do, and to do it in your own way. Again, you don't have to believe anything I just said here, right? I can support this in terms of things that I have read, not only in terms of secondary sources, but also in terms of primary sources, since this is what I do for a living and I'm a researcher. But this is just my educated interpretation of this, right? So if you think something differently, if you buy something that Schulman says that I am in opposition to, if you buy something that I say that Schulman's in opposition to, or Farber would be in opposition to, take what it is that you're learning and what sticks out to you and what sounds most plausible, and put it together for your thesis. Okay, so again, this is my educated interpretation here. You can create your own educated interpretation of this decade and of the other decades and of this these broader themes of the course, right? You can do that for yourself, and that's what I want you to be able to do. Okay, so our next session is going to be a little bit of the 1970s and the end of the 1970s, particularly in terms of politics, so we can understand how Ronald Reagan is elected, and then we can start understanding again how some of the backlash issues are still going to be there in the 1980s, and then also we can discuss how those building blocks that have had new stones put on top of them will get even more stones put on top. And so the idea of this progression of the civil rights movement, or the progression of, say, integration of African Americans into everyday life, or the idea of feminism, that all of these stones that were laid and the foundations that were laid, that they're just going to continue to build and build and build. Okay, all right. So again, I love the 1970s. I hope you guys enjoy the book. I hope you guys enjoy all of the different film clips and all of the different pieces of music that I've put out there for you guys. And you also have a number of documentaries that you can tap into. But I hope you enjoy this and as much as me, and I hope that you kind of recognize just how important this era truly is for the United States, and how much it so very much ties into this idea of contemporary America and the idea of our 21st century America, and that the 1970s really have a great deal to do with how the United States operates on a daily basis today.